a HUD technical assistance provider working with the state of California. I'm joined today by Erica Snyder, also with HUD Technical Assistance, who will be co-facilitating the webinar with me today. Today, you will hear guidance about ramping up staff capacity for rehousing efforts through creative staffing solutions, hiring people with lived experience, and advancing racial equity through hiring, critical uses for ESG-CV, including COVID response, of course, and working with survivors of domestic violence. Next slide, please. So a few logistics before we get started. If you could try to please join by computer audio if possible. We are in webinar format today, so everyone is muted. The webinar is being recorded and we'll send out the link and the materials after today's session. If you are having any technical difficulties, please send a message in the Q&A and we'll work to support you. And please use the chat box for questions and to share ideas with each other. We'd really love for you to use the chat box to help each other out and to interact with our presenters and each other. We have state staff from Housing and Community Development, along with HUD technical assistance providers and guest speakers we are highlighting joining us today to answer questions in the chat box. Let's get the chat started now, including I invite the TA team and our presenters and state staff in the chat to say hello and what community you're from. Throughout the webinar, we encourage you to post your staffing and capacity building strategies to share with each other. Next slide, please. Today, we'll be covering building staff capacity. We'll be focusing on equity and practice, specifically around hiring, supervision, and training. And then we'll be looking at critical uses of ESG-CV with a further drill down on using ESG-CV for survivors of domestic violence, COVID response using ESG-CV, and rehousing with ESG-CV. So again, we invite you to say hello in the chat with your name, pronouns, role, and community. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to Stephanie Hirschberger from California's Department of Housing and Community Development to welcome you today. And next slide, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see everyone here today, and thank you for starting off your week with us for this webinar. I don't want to take too much time away from the wonderful presentation we're about to hear, but I want to take just a minute to acknowledge all of the work you are doing to help our most vulnerable community members. California communities have received an unprecedented amount of state and federal funding to address homelessness. While currently we do not have an aggregated number of persons served under all these funding sources, based on the ESG-CV third quarter report, over 32,000 people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness were reported to have been kept safe, found shelter, or permanent housing. And it is through all of your efforts that many of the people who have received services have found support and hope. Over the past year and a half, almost 2 years now, we have faced extraordinary and difficult situations. With the resurgence of the Delta variant, the challenges are continuing. HCD hopes this webinar can bring additional support and staff capacity to help in the amazing work that is being done. HCD is committed to working with you to end homelessness in California. If this presentation spurs conversations and new ideas within your agency that you want to discuss further, please contact your HCD representative or grant administrators. I'm now going to hand it over to our HUD technical assistance team, Naomi and Erica, to facilitate the webinar for us.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. Next slide, please. So we'd love to get a sense of who is joining us today. Ari is going to be so kind as to start a poll for you to say how you best identify. If none of these are how you identify, feel free to select other. And if you want to plug what that is in the chat, that would be great. So we're going to just take a second to see who's all joining us on this beautiful Monday morning. And Ari, feel free to close the poll so we could see the results in maybe about another 10 seconds. Great. It looks like we have a lot of folks in the room. Rapid Rehousing Provider looks like it's at the top of our mix with COC Lead Agency and street outreach providers coming in close, as long as local government. So thank you all. And if I didn't say your name, we appreciate all of you being here. We know it's a really hectic and busy time. So thanks for making time and space to join us today. Next slide, please. So we wanted to take a moment just to make sure that our conversations and the work that we're doing is grounded and centered in equity in particular. As we're rolling out ESG-CV and continuing to respond to COVID, it's really important that all of our efforts are grounded in equity in particular. And we recognize too that the CARES Act resources were specifically designed to prevent, prepare, and respond to COVID-19. And we know that we want this to reduce the harm that the folks who are most vulnerable of experiencing homelessness have as it relates to COVID. And we want to make sure that our approaches to all of the things that we're doing, from street outreach to rapid rehousing, are equitable, and our services are more equitable, sustaining, and humane. We also all recognize that the safest place for anyone to be at this time is within their own home, as we're responding to a public health crisis, but also long-term, that's the safest and most trauma-informed place for anyone to reside. And recognizing that this last year plus has given the opportunity for us to recognize and evaluate the historic and current racial biases and discrimination that's embedded in our systems overall, practices, policies, and this is a moment for reflection and for us to all pivot to a new way of thinking and responding. And then lastly, that the people who are most harmed by COVID, housing instability, and homelessness include our racial minorities, specifically Black and Indigenous people, those who are elderly, and those who have health problems, especially respiratory problems. Next slide, please. You see in front of you some of the building blocks for equity, and please note, this is not at all comprehensive. We encourage you to add to this as you do your own response in your own community, but we recognize that creating and building equitable outcomes takes time and partnerships. So here are our concrete building blocks. If you're already doing equity work in your systems, we encourage you to keep examining, improving, and growing. If you're just starting out, welcome to the conversation, and we just acknowledge that now is the time. All of the new resources that are available, including ESG-CV, give us that opportunity to advance equitable outcomes for those who are most impacted by COVID. So we thank you all for keeping that center to our work as we go forward and learning together in this space. With that, I'd like to hand it to Naomi to begin talking about staffing options.
Thanks, Erica. Really critical to have that equity lens in mind in everything that we're talking about today and all of our work. And we will be having a deeper dive on some of this as you are ramping up your staff for many of you in your ESG-CV programs. So just to provide a little framing, typically ESG-CV subrecipients are often understaffed. And just to give you a scale comparison, in a normal year, HCD receives around $11 million in ESG regular funds, and ESG-CV there is $315 million. It's a much bigger amount of money. And this unprecedented funding provides an opportunity to augment staff. You can increase your rehousing staff to help more people move quickly from homelessness to housing. It's a chance to maybe reduce the caseloads to where you always wish they could have been. It's a chance to adjust your client staffing ratio. It's also a chance to increase your landlord engagement capacity. We also want to just acknowledge that ramping up these efforts is not instantaneous or easy. There are some real challenges in doing this when you're accustomed to running a program that is much smaller and has not normally had this kind of resource. And this resource does require us to ramp things up, and then it will require us to ramp things down. And we'll address sort of that dynamic and how you can work to navigate the fact that it's a lot of money in such a short amount of time. But it really is such an opportunity to think about how you might do things differently and how you run your ESG program as we continue, unfortunately, to be dealing with COVID. Next slide, please. So when you are thinking about this funding and the fact that it is short term, right? It's going to go through September of 2022. We want to think about how we can ramp up our staffing in a way that's going to be manageable for that process. So here are some ideas to think about, and some of you are probably already doing these things, and we would encourage you to post in the chat how you are managing this large influx of funding and how you are ramping up your staffing. It's always great to share peer ideas. But one way to manage building up staff capacity is to recognize that many of these positions are going to be term limited staff, and just to be upfront about that in your hiring. So to let people know it's a grant funded position, and then however many months or years is going to be, and the opportunity to state that in the job posting. And then when you're bringing people on board, that they're aware that that is what the deal is with this opportunity. You can also use temp agencies or staffing agencies to help you fill these roles. You might want to rethink about how your staff roles or your jobs are organized. So, for example, you might think about whether you could take a case management role and split some of those responsibilities. So maybe you might have an intake coordinator that handles some of the eligibility and paperwork that comes at the beginning. And then you have another staff person who's doing what we might think of as the more traditional case management role of having ongoing appointments with the clients. And this is a way to build up your staff capacity and also potentially to help hire and bring on people who might be newer to the field and are interested in making a career shift, but may not have the depth of experience that you're looking for certain roles. So you're bringing them on and they're helping you, right, with particular aspects of the program operation. You can also think about how you're layering your staff or shifts and creating mobile staff, right? So if you run a street outreach program, for example, or even a rapid rehousing program, and you have always operated, right, in a typical hour. So maybe you operate your street outreach from 7 a.m. in the morning to 3 p.m. in the afternoon, right? This opportunity could give you the chance to add on new shifts that go into the evening, or maybe have weekend coverage. It could give you an opportunity to link up some of your housing focused staff to go out with your street outreach teams. So really think about how you can layer your staffing and shifts and have more mobility in your staffing with all of this additional funding. If you're creating new jobs, you're creating new job descriptions and expectations. This gives you flexibility to bring people on board who are starting off with new expectations and how the work might be done. The other thing that I want to highlight here, and this is not about the direct services piece of this, but with this large amount of money, this is an economic engine, right? This is an opportunity for jobs in your area, right? These are interesting, mission-based job opportunities. There are a lot of people that are looking to switch out of other sectors. We are aware that there are labor shortages. But a lot of what your agencies do is critically important, caring work that if you're willing to look at other sectors, might be a great opportunity for job switchers and switching from one sector to another. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. Another way to ramp up capacity here is hiring people with lived experience of homelessness. And these are just two examples here. One is to hire peer housing specialists. Another is to hire vaccine ambassadors, right, who can go out with your street outreach teams to help with vaccine confidence building, and also within your shelter facilities for vaccine ambassadors. But across all of your staffing, right, look for opportunities and be looking at how you're creating your job roles and descriptions so that you're maximizing the opportunity to bring on board people with lived experience. These are folks who've gone through your system. They know what works and what doesn't work. They'll have an ability to connect with clients in a way that is very unique. There's so much opportunity here for improvements to your system by bringing on folks with lived experience, and of course, the economic benefits and the opportunities for people with lived experience to be in these jobs. And then finally, think about whether it might make sense to think about professional staffing for particular job functions. So if you're looking to bring on a landlord engagement specialist, right, maybe you're going to be looking into the real estate and residential property management sector to help you fill those positions. So not your typical, right, social services sector, but this other sector that knows and understands the language and the needs of property owners. Okay, next slide, please. So these are some of the key staff roles in each of the buckets, right, that you can be thinking about hiring. And some of these, for those of you who've been running ESG for years, it's going to be very familiar to you. But many of you may be new to this because of the expansion of ESG with ESG-CV in your communities. So under street outreach, right, looking to have street outreach be housing focused in addition to meeting people's basic needs. So the ESG-CV gives us an opportunity to hire housing-based case management and rehousing staff that are part of our street outreach efforts, right? Street outreach allows us to hire health and mental health staff, especially important during a pandemic. And we can also have transportation staff, right, that can help get staff moved around, but also can do things like help bring clients to local vaccination clinics. And under rapid rehousing and emergency shelter, of course, the same thing. We want all of our programming under ESG to be geared towards housing and moving people towards permanent housing. So having those housing-based case management and rehousing staff, also health and mental health staff. And this is something that's new actually under rapid rehousing with the new ESG-CV notice, is the ability, right, to bring on health and mental health staff, childcare and education staff, and transportation staff. Okay, next slide, please. So under rapid rehousing, right, a few other things to highlight here, right? You're looking to bring on housing navigators. You can bring on, as I mentioned previously, specialists for landlord engagement. You want housing focused case management, right? So once folks are in their housing, right, helping them to maintain it. And let's not forget our financial management staff. They are critical for running our rapid rehousing programs. They are the ones that make sure that landlords are getting paid on time with what we've agreed to with them in our rental agreements. So making sure that our landlords have one of their most basic needs met, which is having their rent paid on time. So your financial management staff, which are really a key part of your program staff and rapid rehousing, are critical to making your program run smoothly. All right, next slide, please. So why is building up staff capacity important? Well, first, we don't want to burn out our existing staff, right? We want to make sure that we have enough staff on hand, right, to cover what we need to do. We have the ability to serve more clients and help them move to housing, right? So right at its very basic level, this funding opportunity is the ability to serve a lot more people and to help them move to housing. It can help us set up reasonable staff-client ratios. It's a chance to build landlord partnerships for the long haul, right? So even if, right, a position that you maybe hire for ESG-CV around landlord engagement, right, is going to need to end at the end of the ESG-CV time period, you can intentionally create and build out the work that they and other partners are doing to be able to continue right after that position ends. And maybe you're going to think about how you could continue it with other funding. Maybe this is an opportunity to show what an important role it is, and you have local community philanthropic partners that might be willing to fund something like that over the long haul. And then that's also is to provide a suite of services needed to really make a difference in people's lives. So there's a lot of flexibility under the ESG-CV program that's a bit different than the regular ESG program, that during this COVID time period really allows you basically to soup up the services to make sure that you're meeting people's health and mental health needs related to COVID, related to experiencing homelessness, to make sure their basic needs are met and that they are connected as swiftly and quickly to housing as possible. Next slide, please. So where can you find new staff besides the usual places? Like I said earlier, we're quite aware that there are labor shortages across the country, including in many parts of California. Here are just some ideas to consider, and love to see in the chat if some of you are doing some of these, or if you have other ideas that you don't see listed here. So you'll see we've highlighted at the top former clients and volunteer base. So this is a great opportunity to look at who you're already engaged with or your alumni, essentially. So use this opportunity to hire former clients, people with lived experience of homelessness. Look at who your current volunteer base is. Would any of them be a good fit for your open positions? Right? Look at the industries in your area that have been impacted by COVID and where there may have been layoffs or shutdowns and where there are crossover skills. Examples include tourism, hotels and restaurants, the service sector, education and healthcare. And in some of these sectors, some of them have been, curtailed, some places completely shut down. And in some other sectors like education and healthcare, we're seeing people having burnout, wanting to make a career shift, do something differently. And so that could be an opportunity. And of course, looking at your local high school and community colleges and university graduates and really thinking through which jobs really need certain degrees and where you can provide on-the-job training. You want to make sure that your job requirements and descriptions are really accurately reflecting what's actually needed in the job. So you're not artificially constraining or restricting who might be able to apply. Right? Again, many people out there with life experience and also with lived experience of homelessness that could be great fits for a lot of these positions. Next slide, please. So once you've got folks on board, right, what are we doing to retain them, right? So it's also attracting them and then keeping them, right? You all know the usual. You want to try to have your pay and benefits be as competitive as possible, but a few other things. A reminder that ESG-CV allows for hazard pay for frontline staff. So this could be a way to attract and retain staff. You want to make sure that you're providing solid onboarding training and ongoing training, support, and supervision. This is not easy work, and staff need support. So make sure you're building in those support structures so folks know where they can go to get help as they're learning to do this work, or even if they've been doing it for a long time, they have the support they need. Another way to help attract and retain staff is to think about how you can be flexible with shifts and hours and think about options to work from home depending on what the role is. And then the other thing is that all of you are doing mission-based work, and that piece may be very attractive for those looking to make a difference in their community. Next slide, please. Another idea is to consider a shared hiring strategy. So if there are multiple agencies or organizations in your community that are trying to hire up with ESG-CV, or maybe with some of the other buckets of money that continue to roll into our community, think about whether you might be able to do some shared recruiting, hiring, and training. Share the work and the benefits while building your community partnerships. So some examples are maybe you'd have a shared recruitment strategy, right, where you are posting together similar job postings using the same platforms, public service announcements, so that you're getting kind of a bigger bang for your buck. You might decide to have shared or similar job postings. And if you want to take this to an even deeper level, you might think about some shared initial screening and maybe some crossover training. If there's another organization that's maybe doing a very similar kind of work that you're looking to do. So maybe in your community, there are 3 rapid rehousing providers, and you're each going to be hiring between 3 and 5 new housing navigators. Maybe it would make sense to work together to have a shared hiring strategy for those positions. Okay, next slide, please. All right, the funding is not ongoing. So I've mentioned some of these already, but just to reiterate, right, you can procure contractors for short-term assistance. You can tap into your local government, social services, human service, or health services capacity. You can make those short-term hires and provide training and be upfront that it's term limited, right? And determine which job components might be easier to accomplish with short-term hires. Next slide, please. And this is just a reminder for some of you that are the direct grantees from HCD, right? You are also able to carry out the ESG functions if you have the capacity to do so, in addition to your normal, subbing out to local community organizations. But maybe within your county or jurisdiction, you yourself might have capacity to help with vaccine rollout through your local health department. Maybe you have the ability to do some in-house housing navigation, and maybe to have a landlord engagement specialist housed in your shop that works for the whole community. Maybe the same thing for a street outreach coordinator and also your HMIS data system staffing. Next slide, please. All right, we want to take a moment to do a quick poll to see. I see there's stuff happening in the chat right now, and I've been talking, so I haven't been able to keep up with it, but it looks like there are some ideas there. We'd like to hear from you. What capacity building strategies you're using in your community, and you can choose more than one. And we welcome you to put in the chat if there's something you're doing that you don't see here. So give this a moment. So Ari, when you think we've got enough responses, you can go ahead and publish. Okay, interesting. It looks like a lot of you are reorganizing your staff roles. That's the winner here. But we also have a bunch of people hiring term limited employees and also creating new roles like landlord engagement specialists. And a bunch of you are also hiring people with lived experience of homelessness. This is great to hear. I encourage all of you to populate the chat with what you're doing. And those of you who are hiring people with lived experience of homelessness, we'd love to hear from you in the chat, how you're doing that and how it's going. All right, let's close out that poll. Right. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce Ashley Kerr, who's joining us today, who's going to do a deeper dive on equity in practice, hiring, supervision, and training. So as we're looking to ramp up all of these new staff, how can we make sure that we're embedding equity in those processes? So Ashley, I will hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Naomi. Next slide, please. So why are we leading with race equity? It is our ethical responsibility that the needs of all of our community members experiencing homelessness are met. Serving those with just the lowest needs, greatest visibility, and stronger ability to access services and housing will not end homelessness. It also strengthens our aspiring allyship and responses to each other and the communities we serve, and helps build greater community trust. We know that this pandemic has not only impacted the populations that we serve, but has impacted many of us personally. Leading with race equity in our hiring, supervision, and training support measures allows us to see the wholeness of people, meet them where they are, and be better reflective of and culturally responsive to the needs of those we serve. Everyone benefits when we lead with a racial equity lens. Next slide, please. So let's talk about a few reminders. This work is not instantaneous. Achieving equity, particularly racial equity, takes time. It will not happen overnight, and it will not happen with a few tools or approaches. It is a true cultural shift, and these shifts take time and effort. This is also a journey. It will require many resets. It's going to challenge our constraints with time, system deadlines, and goal accomplishments. It's work that will require our continuous assessment and development of long-term approaches. Achieving racial equity requires work at the individual, organizational, and systemic levels. We will get in our own way if we think only about making a few system adjustments rather than recognizing that achieving system transformation takes a much more intentional process. This is also multifaceted. It exists and should be carried out at multiple levels and in multiple ways. Thus, why is it important to center in our organizational hiring, supervision, and training actions? And lastly, let's just remember that this work is not on top of, but should be seen as a part of our systems response. Next slide, please. As we think about what our organizations can do to lead with racial equity, we must focus on our people, our culture, and our systems. This includes diversifying our organizations, analyzing and assessing our behavior, assessing our policies and practices to ensure that we are always promoting an inclusive environment and actively integrating our internal work with the work of our external partners to collectively transform the systems in which we work and live. Now let's start to talk through different action items that organizations can engage with as they are starting to lead or continuing to lead with racial equity. Next slide, please. Let's talk about assessing the representation of our staff. Consider doing an internal audit of staffing diversity across race, but also across gender, ability, and identity in order to also look through the lens of intersectionality. Look at how and where our people are positioned. Consider if there are ways to amplify an individual's leadership and provide promotion. If there are not ways to monetarily support promotion at the moment, then consider what other benefits could be extended to promoted staff in the interim while sources that increase pay are identified. So thinking about flexible work hours, Naomi mentioned that in the previous section, but also what about offering holidays for the holidays that individuals participate and celebrate in rather than the traditional holidays that we often take time off of. Also, let's looking at reviewing and aligning our salary schedules. Looking at the salaries, seeing if they are equitable to the work and the required experience, looking at this for both existing staff and future staff. And then lastly, reviewing and adjusting hiring policies and procedures. And Naomi touched on some of this earlier. But look to identify where practices of equity can be added or strengthened. For example, which positions within the organization really do require specific educational requirements? Which ones don't, and those requirements are arbitrary? Broaden where job postings can be placed. This could be including HBCUs, nationwide, other professional or collegial organizations. This likely means that organizations will need to commit additional dollars to expand job posting locations. Next slide, please. As we think about supervision, check bias. As supervisors, we sometimes must have to check our own bias. This means doing our own reflective equity work and perhaps asking ourselves questions such as, how do I take up space that may be taking away from other staff leading? Do I assume staff capabilities? Do I make assumptions about what folks are suited to do? Do I assign my values and beliefs on staff about the way particular things should be done? Sometimes this bias gets in the way of us supporting staff, hearing what their needs are, and working with them to meet their professional development needs in ways that resonate with them and are culturally responsive. Think about exploring leadership opportunities. Supervision doesn't just have to be about technical guidance or performance review and feedback. It should really also allow opportunities to support staff in identifying where they are leading or opportunities where they could lead. Sometimes this takes us really broadening our definition of what leadership is and encourages us to share power. Identify areas where, as a supervisor, power can be shared. So think about decision-making, collaborative leadership, information sharing, and requesting ideas and feedback. And also identifying feedback loop processes. So one thing I often did in supervision was ask the question at the end, what can I do for you? I've also had people that I supervise ask me, what feedback do you have for me? This ongoing communication and collaboration really allows the space for growth and the nurturing of that relationship. Demonstrating that the opportunity for accountability in leading is shared and not one-sided really goes a long way and is a better way to have collaborative leadership and investment in your team. Next slide, please. On to training. Let's institutionalize equity capacity building. So identifying organizational resources to support equity capacity building during onboarding, both financial and time resources, right? So we're going to have to put money in to onboarding and thinking about equity from the very beginning throughout the work. And assign allocations that will allow continued staff education on equity, system oppression, and other aspects of racial equity work. Remember, we said this was a continuous evolving journey, and so we should always be seeking out resources to enhance our knowledge, understanding, and practice. Think about allocating resources through an equity lens. So that means really understanding that providing training resources for staff may mean a more equitable approach rather than an equal approach. To provide equitable training opportunities and access is to recognize that there will be a difference in the levels and types of resource support and access that staff need. Information from the audits aligned with feedback from supervision and performance evaluation may be able to identify who is being advanced in leadership more often and where and for who disparities in access to trainings exist. So I just want to conclude, I'm going to turn it back over to Naomi, but this is an ongoing evolution of our work. This involves a lot of investment of time and resources. But in the end, if you continue to think about continuous quality improvement, you will see that you are more equitable as you continue in your journeys than you were at the beginning. Thanks, Naomi. I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Ashley. Really appreciate it. We recognize, right, that this work is layered, and we encourage you wherever you are in this journey, if you have been doing a lot of what Ashley just said, to keep doing it and to have an iterative process to make improvements. And if you're just starting, to really jump in, make sure you're not doing it alone, and be thoughtful about how you're doing it, and set some goals and get going on it. And with all of this new funding, this is a real opportunity to build in some of these equitable practices. If we could go to the next slide, please. We want to just take another poll here to see where folks are at. So the question here is, my organization is taking concrete actions to increase equity in our team processes and infrastructure, such as in contracting and procurement, hiring, communications, partnerships, etc. So just think about where your organization is and whether you strongly agree, somewhat disagree, don't know, pick one of those options. Again, just remembering that this is a journey. And if you're just getting started, we hope that some of the materials today can help you with that process of ramping up your equity efforts. Just give folks a moment here to respond. And Ari, when you think we've got a good response, we can go ahead and publish. Okay. That's great. That's great to see that it looks like the overwhelming majority of your organizations have started to take steps to increase equity in your processes around building up staff capacity. Fantastic. Well, I would love to have some of you post in the chat what you are doing. So tell us what you're doing for hiring and retention and training with the equity lens. I know your peers would love to hear suggestions, and we can help each other cross-pollinate. All right, next slide, please. Right. It's my pleasure now to introduce Andrea Curry, who is the Continuum of Care Coordinator for the Tehama Continuum of Care with Empower Tehama. And she's going to be talking about engaging non-traditional partners and hiring staff with lived experience using ESG-CV. So they've been on a journey with this COVID funding, and it's going to be great to hear from her how they've been doing this. So Andrea, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. It's so great to be with you all here this morning. I'm Andrea Curry from Tehama County COC. Tehama County is a small rural county up in the northern part of the state. So we are a small single county COC. We have, as Naomi had mentioned, this infusion of funding has been a great advantage, but is also made it necessary for us to, really strategize around how to build staff capacity, how to make sure that we can make use of the funds to serve folks to the greatest extent possible. So next slide, please. So one of the strategies that we have really gone hard with is engaging non-traditional partners as our subrecipients. As I said, we are a really small area, so there's not a lot of capacity for providers and other community partners to really ramp up. We have kind of a limited number of community partners who provide housing services. So we have kind of called upon some of our community partners that work in other fields to build our capacity. And a lot of these folks at these community providers have long wanted to make sure that the folks they serve have better access to housing services. And they also have staff and programs that were already working in similar capacities. So case managers, for instance, one of our non-traditional partners is NCCDI, who is our Head Start provider here in Tehama County, actually. So they do a lot of work with the families that have preschool age children, and they also have existing relationships with some of the underserved communities in our area, which is around that equity lens, something that we have been intentionally looking to improve about the reach of our services. So their existing relationships with these communities has been really helpful. So 27% of the families that they served in 2020 were Spanish speaking only. So they do have a great staff of bilingual folks and bicultural folks who really have the trust of these families. But less than 12% of the NCCDI families that were experiencing homelessness received any assistance with that homelessness in 2020. So we were able to align our goals, because one of their goals was to improve the access that their families had to housing services. And one of our goals was to make sure that this underserved community had access to the services that that the COC can provide. So, and they really do have a good reach with these families. 38% of the Latino preschoolers in Tehama County are enrolled in one of their programs. So it really is a great way for us to reach these families, and then also to empower their staff to assist the families that they're serving with housing, which is really integral to their stability, and even with the children's ability to participate wholly in school. Next slide. And then another one of the non-traditional partners that we've engaged is actually a a program that's within Powertame. And Powertame is primarily a victim services agency, but we also provide services for all persons impacted by domestic violence. So the BIP Perspectives program provides what's referred to in the law as batterer intervention program, which we tend to stay away a little bit from the use of that term, but that is the official term. So folks who have been convicted of a domestic violence offense are often court ordered to attend these classes. And these are folks who have significant background barriers to finding housing. They're also often hesitant to seek out traditional services. But this is a program that's already working with that population and has already developed trust with them, has a rapport with them, but then also has credibility in the community when they talk about the changes that these folks are making in their lives. So being able to empower them to provide rapid rehousing services directly out of their program using case managers who know the population and understand what they struggle with and understand their fears and their concerns has been really helpful. So through both of these partnerships, we have really been able to kind of co-opt some of the capacity that these programs already have. They already have trained case managers that work with the population that they serve, and the goals of the programs already align, making sure that folks can increase their stability and have what they need to live healthy, stable lives. That's a common goal of all of our services. So being able to empower them has been a great way to innovate, and something that we had never really been able to do before, even though we knew about the alignment of goals and that kind of thing. So this increased capacity or increased funding has given us a chance to do that. And it's also built some great relationships with these programs that we only kind of saw as, parallel services previous to this. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, another strategy that we have really put into practice is hiring staff with lived experience. We have one provider who has always had an excellent track record with hiring folks with lived experience. And ESG-CV has given them the opportunity to really expand into that, to really go hard into making sure that that folks who want jobs have jobs. So there are the benefits of hiring folks with lived experiences is really at least threefold, the way we see it. So there are benefits to the current participants in the program. They have staff that they can relate to, and I'm sure that I saw in the poll that a lot of us are hiring folks with lived experiences, and I'm sure that you've seen this as much as we have, that there's an instant connection there when you know that someone really relates to what you're saying and really understands, and that's really important for credibility. So that trust and rapport, it happens faster. And when you're in a crisis situation, finding someone who can genuinely help you faster is always something that we're looking for. They don't have to explain as much. I know it sounds a little silly, but there are certain things about experiencing homelessness that if you're talking to someone who has never experienced it, there's going to be a lot of background explanations that you need to provide so that someone can understand your situation. Whereas folks with lived experiences, especially folks who have experienced homelessness in your area, usually already know what they're talking about when they say certain things. So the other benefit that it has for the folks who are participants in your program is that they have a realistic example of someone who has made some changes, who has taken advantage of the services that were offered to them, and who is stable now. we can all say, hey, you can do it, you know, we believe in you. But seeing someone who has really actually done the thing that they're trying to do has a much bigger impact. Next slide, please. Okay, and so getting on to the benefits to the project, folks with lived experiences, especially those who have gone through some of your services, are going to be able to give you some honest insights into your program and how it's designed. Sometimes they're not comfortable to hear, but you want to make sure that you have a space that is open, that you can hear these things in. They can tell you how accessible your program is to folks experiencing homelessness. And we do have some examples that actually got from one of the program managers over there at PATH, the program that we have that is really good at implementing this strategy. And you know, she said that one of the folks that they hired on explained to her that nobody's going to walk across town to get a free meal if the energy that it takes to walk across town is more than what that meal is going to provide for them. So, you know, they're not going to walk 2 miles to get a meal, even if it's free, if they're going to be more hungry by the time they get back to wherever they're camped. And that was really something that helped them actually make concrete changes in the program to make sure that, hey, we're going to, you know, if someone comes to get a meal, we're going to make sure that they have a meal to take with them, so that they can eat when it's convenient for them and without having to wait. Another part of that was that they had originally intended to only be handing out like food bags at their day center, you know, at certain times during the day, you know, breakfast, lunch, and dinner kind of thing. And from some of the advice that they got from the folks that they had hired, they realized that that was not going to work for everybody, that people needed to be able to show up and get a food bag when they could get there, because they're not necessarily, you know, because of the barriers, because of the obstacles that they might have to cross in order to get there, really needed to be available to them anytime. Another benefit to the projects is that you are serving as a model for other community employers. We know that sometimes folks are hesitant. They may have apprehensions or fears about hiring folks who have gaps in their resume, who are open about their experiences of homelessness. And this is a way that you can show those employers that, look, you know, we're doing it and we are having success with it. And this is a resource that you as employers can tap into that can really benefit your business. And so being that example really is helpful. And then also, you have staff that already understand the systems. That could be your system, you know, how your rapid rehousing program works, but it also can be the mainstream services system. I mean, there are little pieces of practical advice that someone with lived experiences can provide, like don't show up at social services at 11 o'clock in the morning because the desk is only going to have one person during lunch. Those little things that can really actually make a difference in someone's success. They can provide those pieces of advice, and also they can understand the frustrations that folks going through, you know, trying to navigate through those systems are experiencing, and can acknowledge them. So next slide. And then benefits to the staff with lived experiences. And if we keep in mind that this is the population that we are serving, and that our service to them doesn't end when we exit them, when we exit them from our rapid rehousing program. Our intent is to provide long-term stability. So they get to step up in a familiar setting, someplace that they don't feel apprehensive about, that they understand, that they feel like experts in. They have employers that truly want them to succeed, that they know aren't just looking for a place to fail them and get rid of them. They do know that their skills and experience are truly valued within that space. And then also being a part of something that they know works. I know that all of us have probably had experiences where at times in our lives we've worked for employers that we just needed a paycheck, and we knew we could do the job, but our heart wasn't in it. And the difference in how enriching an experience of employment is really does hinge on how much you believe in what you're doing for work. So that gives them a chance to be part of something that they know works and that they know is doing good. And then lastly, gaining employment experiences. Sometimes folks may not intend to stay in this field forever, and that's okay. But getting experience with the, things like showing up on time, teamwork, how to deal with conflicts with coworkers and that kind of thing can really prepare them and give them confidence then to go on and pursue other career goals that they have. So let's see. I believe, I'm not sure if we had time for Q&A or not. Guys, let me know.
We do, Andrea, and thank you so much for that fabulous presentation. There was a question asked in the chat that I'd love to ask you live, and I know you've touched on this, and there's also some back and forth in the chat, but what are some of the strategies that you use to prioritize or even identify applicants with lived expertise?
Well, I think that for one thing, just posting your job announcements in the places that folks are frequenting. Sometimes you need to be a little creative about where you're putting your job postings. I know that we always connect the folks who are in our programs, we connect them to our job training center, which is a local nonprofit. So we make sure they're posted there. But places like, social services who have bulletin boards that you can put these job postings on. Don't be afraid to post jobs in spots that you don't see other job postings posted in. But I think a lot of the connections that develop that get folks connected to these jobs really are within the program, are within, like at the day center that they have. Folks can still come in and pick up food and things even after they're housed through rapid rehousing. So having those jobs posted even there is great. And also just letting folks know, hey, if you're looking for employment, consider us as an employer. And you can let them know within that program, even when you're working with them. I think we need to keep in mind that homelessness impacts folks from all walks of life. And if we want to be genuine about erasing stigmas around homelessness, then I think that we need to lead by example in saying that that's not a disqualifying factor. I myself experienced homelessness as a youth and then later as a victim of domestic violence. And, the position that I'm in, to be able to provide the, to coordinate the COC, that experience did not make me ineligible for that. And I think that that's really important for us to keep in mind, that just because someone has experienced homelessness does not mean that they are not right for the jobs that we have. In fact, those are the kind of stigmas that we're trying to erase. So.
Yes, exactly. Andrew, thank you for addressing stigma, because it's so just rampant in our field and in the community broadly. And thank you for sharing some of your own story. I think it's really powerful to hear examples of what that looks like. And it's a very tangible step towards erasing that stigma. So you are fabulous. And thank you for all of that.
Thank you.
And we don't necessarily have time right now for more questions, but keep them going in the chat. I know Andrea is available to kind of read through that. She was presenting, so if you had questions for her, she just wasn't able to see them. So with that though, thank you, Andrea, and I'd love to hand it back over to Naomi to talk with us a little bit about assisting domestic violence survivors.
Thanks, Erica. And thank you so much, Andrea. I really appreciate it. And there are some great comments in the chat about the topic that Andrea was just talking about. So I really encourage all of you to take a look and to chime in to that conversation. So we want to spend the next portion of the webinar thinking about different critical uses of ESG-CV. And there are many, because the whole point of ESG regularly is it's a life-saving program focused on street outreach, shelter, and rapid rehousing. And during this time period that we're in with COVID, it's taken on even more urgency. And so first, we're going to start by looking at assisting domestic violence survivors with ESG-CV. We've always been able to use regular ESG for this purpose, and we want to make sure and continue that activity with our ESG-CV funds. Next slide, please. So I want to just get a pulse check on where folks are with your partnerships as we launch into this topic. Do you have connections or partnerships with your local domestic violence organization? Just take a moment to answer that poll. All right, and Ari, go ahead and post the results when you feel like we've got enough response. Oh, that's fantastic. Most of you have relationships with your existing local domestic violence organization. That's great. As we talk today, we're going to talk about why that's so important. And most of you hopefully are really already deeply enmeshed with each other to be able to provide support to survivors. All right, next slide, please. So ESG, just like for anyone who is experiencing homelessness, is available to provide life-saving services to survivors: shelter, street outreach, prevention, and housing. Partnering with your local domestic violence organization is critical. They can assist with staff training and referrals, and they may even be someone in your community who's running ESG-CV or regular ESG programs to be able to work with survivors of domestic violence. We know that even if you have a strong domestic violence partner organization in your community, there's no way that they can probably serve everyone in your community who is experiencing domestic violence. And so folks who are experiencing domestic violence end up in our other community programs looking for help and support. And because of that, it's critical that ESG staff are trained on what to do if a program participant shares that they are in danger, and how to work with domestic violence survivors who are not in immediate danger, their unique needs, and how to respond. And again, this is where your DV partner organization can help you. And there are also state and national organizations, one of which we're going to hear from in just a moment, who are also available to help support you with trainings and tools and materials to make sure that you feel your staff are trained and ready. Under regular ESG and ESG-CV, domestic violence survivors are highlighted as a special population where essential services can be designed to meet their needs. So they're eligible, right, for ESG as long as they meet the other eligibility criteria. But we just wanted to point out that they are called out as a special population, which allows you to design some of the essential services to meet their unique needs. So during this ramp up period with all these CV funds, this is another way that you could think about directing some of your funding. The other thing I want to highlight is that the ESG Rapid Rehousing Program can be flexibly designed to meet the unique needs of survivors. The ESG Rapid Rehousing Program in general is a flexible program that has some framework that's required by HUD, but there's a lot of room there for local design. And in a best case scenario, we're designing it so that we can meet the unique needs of each individual household. And we're really using progressive engagement and assistance, including being able to scale up or scale down the amount of rental assistance or services that a household might need, depending on what's going on with them at the moment while they're enrolled in the program. And so to really think about as you're ramping up your rapid rehousing programs, to be cognizant and to thoughtfully design for the unique needs of domestic violence survivors. Next slide, please. And so on this very topic, we are very pleased to have Peg from the National Alliance for Safe Housing, or NASH, with us today to do a deeper dive on this. And she's really going to give an example here of why it's so important to partner with your local DV organizations. She and her colleagues are doing this at a national level and are going to be providing some great tips today. Peg, we're so glad that you're here with us, and I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thanks, Naomi. And thank you for that segue. I feel like so much of what I'm going to be speaking to has been touched on. So, and given the partnerships that it looks like already exist among the participants, this should be an easygoing. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about rapid rehousing for DV survivors. Next slide. So a little bit about NASH. We provide training and technical assistance to help build partnerships between domestic violence and sexual violence programs and homeless and housing providers, so that survivors don't fall through the gaps between those two systems. And really what we're aiming to do is to ensure that everyone has safe housing, particularly those who have the least access to it. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be talking about survivors' needs in the housing spectrum with a particular focus on rapid rehousing. But basically, survivors have a range of needs depending on their situations and interests. Some survivors may want shelter if they're looking for a safe, confidential refuge. Some may need a long-term subsidy if they face particularly high barriers to housing. Some survivors may actually want to keep their own housing and simply need help maintaining it safely. And then some may want to quickly establish new affordable housing for themselves and their families. And that's where rapid rehousing might make the most sense. Next slide, please. So you all are familiar with the principles of rapid rehousing: participant directed, no preconditions, tailored services, financial assistance, and a value on partnerships. So I'm not gonna spend a ton of time on that. Next slide, please. I'm sure that you're also familiar with the three core components of rapid rehousing: support with housing identification, help with rent and move-in costs, and case management to support housing stability. But those components, when we're considering rapid rehousing for survivors, have some additional considerations. Next slide, please. So in terms of housing identification, you may need to act as a broker between the survivor and the prospective landlord in order to facilitate the rental. And this is because landlords may expect trouble if they know that the tenant is a survivor of domestic violence. They may be anticipating the abuser coming and creating trouble, or police visits. And so that's gonna be an influence or a factor in whether they lease up to survivors. Survivors may also have a poor rental or credit history due to the violence that they've experienced. They may have pets that, if left with the abuser, could also be abused as a means of the abuser getting back at the survivor. And so the survivor doesn't want to abandon their pets. Also, a lot of affordable housing, if it's in a high crime area, which we know so much affordable housing is, may trigger additional trauma for survivors who have just left a really volatile situation. And so it might not be a good place for survivors to live. And then, some locations just aren't safe if the abuser lives nearby. So these are all considerations when you're thinking about housing identification. Next slide. In terms of financial assistance with housing costs, it's important to consider that survivors may have debt and rent arrears that arose from the abuse that they've experienced. And so it's going to be important to be able to translate the causes for that and help the survivor get over that when you're thinking about making a housing match. They may not have access to personal resources because of their families and social supports that have become disconnected due to the violence that that survivor's experienced. So the traditional resources just aren't available to them. They may not have steady employment because of sabotage by an abuser that leads to insufficient incomes, which makes it really hard to maintain rent. They may also be involved in other systems, such as the criminal justice system or child welfare system, which also can have an impact on their financial health. And then the trauma that they've experienced can complicate their ability to get and keep consistent incomes. And so you have to take all of those things into account when you're planning the financial assistance that you're going to offer to survivors. Next slide, please. Finally, regarding case management services and support to survivors, survivors may have complex needs. Such as trauma-informed care that recognizes and allows for the violent situations that survivors have just left. Providing support around civil, legal, or immigration status, as well as social supports for survivors. So case management may look like something more than just goal planning. Helping with employment and financial needs that result from the history of abuse, like the issues that I highlighted on the last slide. Support around possible criminal histories that result from coercion by the abuser. Possible chemical dependency that may have started with the abuser or as a result of the abuse and that the survivor is still dealing with. And then the potential for stalking after the survivor has left a violent abuser. And all of these are going to be issues that you're going to want to take into consideration when you're providing services and support. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of issues to consider when providing rapid rehousing for survivors, but there's also a number of modifications that can be made to accommodate survivors' unique needs. And as Naomi said, rapid rehousing programs can be flexible. So when helping survivors identify housing, even before lease up, make sure that you incorporate safety planning with survivors so that they can plan for where they want to live, for how they can remain safe in their housing, and what supports they have to help them. Make the rental subsidy of flexible length to accommodate the complex needs that survivors have. Time limits need to be adaptable so that they meet survivors' unique situations. It may not be something that they can fit within 3 months or even renewable up to a year, and it's important to match that to the survivor's needs. You may want to conduct some education with landlords in your networks on how they can work best with survivors, just to allay any fears that the landlords may have. Definitely provide survivors with the opportunity to opt out of informational releases or keep them releases that is very time limited and narrow so that personally identifying information is kept private and confidential as it makes sense in helping the survivor. Also, help prepare survivors to talk with landlords about their credit or housing history so that the survivors have a way to be transparent with landlords, and they can talk about how that abuse history may have impacted their credit or rental histories. If survivors are being stalked or threatened by their abusers in their new housing, it may become imperative to help them find alternative housing. And so it's going to be really important that you have other placements for them in those situations. Case management, like housing placement, should be trauma informed. So you're providing survivors with services and support at their own pace and time to help them manage their new living situations at a rate that they can deal with. In addition to your network of landlords, You may want to have relationships with public housing authorities, your local continuum of care, and other homeless and housing providers in order to be able to provide survivors with a wide range of housing options. And then become familiar with the federal, state, and local laws, such as the Violence Against Women Act, that protect survivors' housing rights. There are some specific protections that are available to survivors in housing, and I think it's really important to know what those are and to help survivors access those protections. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to take a minute to highlight some additional considerations when working with survivors from culturally specific communities. Housing may be complicated for these survivors because the ties that they have are essential to their support systems and stability. So it's important to try to balance the survivor's safety with their interest in remaining connected to their community. It's important to find out what the survivor wants and then try to work with them around that. Also, gentrification often makes affordable housing difficult to find in some traditional neighborhoods, which obviously creates a barrier for housing placement. So be creative around what kind of housing would be best for the survivor. Maybe it's in an apartment rental, maybe it's with somebody in their community who has a room to let or a basement apartment or something to that effect, but work again with the survivor to make sure that it's safe and that it's convenient to their community or nearby if possible. And then finally, if the housing placement is far removed from the survivor's community, it can create additional trauma, such as when Native American survivors have to move off the reservation. So again, it's important to consider survivors' needs and wants when looking for housing placements. Next slide, please. So here are some helpful tips. Again, incorporate safety planning throughout your programs at housing placement, at case management. Even if the survivor is exiting from your housing, it's important to be thinking about safety planning all the time. Advocate with landlords to understand and work with tenant survivors. So you may find, as we often did, that landlords have many more survivors living in their properties than just the ones that you've placed there. And so providing landlords with that understanding and those skills to work with survivors is going to help them overall. Reassure landlords that survivors have a specific interest in maintaining their lease agreements and the safety of their units. In fact, survivors may be better tenants because of their status and not just despite it. And if necessary, offer guarantees to the landlords, such as additional security deposits, and your willingness to help if any issues arise so that the landlord knows they have support as well. Next slide, please. Remember that you don't have to do it all. As Naomi mentioned, and I think Andrea mentioned, there are a lot of domestic violence programs that would be happy to help you work with survivors, especially if they know that it might lead to additional housing options for the survivors that they serve. If there are any service modifications that you make to employ voluntary, trauma-informed, survivor-driven care, understand that that helps restore dignity and agency to the survivor who's coming from a situation where they had none. So you're helping them to recover from the abuse just in that respect. And again, you can tailor your program to meet survivors' needs using a DV lens and help maintain connections with their support networks. Next slide. Finally, as you're thinking about all of this, keep a few things in mind. Survivors, as I said, have not had power and control over their own lives while living with an abuser. So be sure not to blame them for their situations. It can be easy to think that a survivor is apathetic or resistant, or that there's some outstanding issue to complying with program requirements or expectations, when really it might just be the trauma that they've experienced that's making it hard for them to feel like they can make decisions or that they have control over their own lives. So it's important to take time and allow survivors to pursue things at their own speed and on their own terms. Knowing the laws that protect survivors will help you support their housing. And when survivors are in housing, the abuser may show up or threaten them or otherwise put them at risk. So again, work with the landlord and authorities to help the survivor, not punish her for the abuser's actions. Again, safety planning is a process that should be revisited frequently when survivors are in housing. Survivors know their situations best, and those situations change all the time. So they also know best how to protect themselves, and it's really important to partner with them in developing those plans. And then finally, develop a transfer policy to help survivors move in an emergency and use those partnerships that you've developed with the other housing providers that you know. I think the main message here that I want to convey is just that whatever accommodations you make for survivors in your programs, they're going to be good for everyone that you serve. While those modifications are important for survivors, they are helpful for anyone who faces homelessness and will ultimately help everyone be successful in housing. And I think that's all I had to say. Next slide. Thank you. And my information is there and website. So if you're interested in more information about what I just presented or anything else, feel free to reach out.
Peg, thank you so much. And I also posted the website link in the chat. Lots of great resources on your website on everything that you were just talking about. We did have a question that came in from the chat that I'm going to toss to you. The question is there a particular organization or training resource that provides good education and program implementation strategies using trauma-informed care for housing agencies?
We have done several trauma-informed care trainings through NASH that are specific to serving domestic violence survivors. But I can certainly point you to some other options. Let me research it and I'll send the information to Naomi to share out.
Wonderful. And we can include that when we send out the slides. And Andrea, who was one of our earlier presenters, is chiming in here. Her organization is a DV organization, saying that local DV organizations are often available and able to help with this topic and training around it. So great idea, Andrea. Again, Peg, thank you so much. It's critical that we're embedding the needs of domestic violence survivors throughout our ESG programming and being there with them as they're on their journey and helping them move to housing as quickly and as safely as possible and taking our cues from them as we're doing that. So thanks again, Peg. We really appreciate it. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Today. All right, and now I am going to turn it over to Erica for the next portion.
Great. So we're going to chat a little bit about the critical uses of ESG-CV for the COVID response, in part because we know we're coming into the colder months of the year, in which case flu season and other things are more prevalent, as well as the fact that there are different variants going around for COVID. And so this is like a refresher for some of the other areas that we really need to be continuing to up our practices. Next slide, please. So some general framing, like I mentioned before, I think ever since the start of this pandemic, there's been various phases of scaling up and scaling back. And we just want to continue everyone on the call and your agencies to continue with your health practices, or if they've been a bit relaxed, to reactivate them and those safety measures during this time. And this includes a wide variety of things, including vaccination efforts for your clients and for your staff, maintaining and increasing non-congregate shelter beds, and just ensuring that there's space for everyone to be safe in that respect. Also making sure that we still have safe spaces for isolation and for quarantine for folks who might be testing positive to COVID or waiting for results. And then implementing COVID symptom screenings, having your staff and folks aware of what that is, and recognizing though that throughout all of these things, they should not be creating barriers to entry into programs, but just opportunities for increased safety. Having the ability to actually have personal protective equipment for both your staff and for anybody accessing services. People shouldn't have to choose between spending funding on health or versus food. And so there's an opportunity with ESG-CV to actually provide those face masks, hand sanitizer, gloves, what people need to be safe during these times. As well as if you are operating a shelter that isn't non-congregate, look at those mitigation strategies that have been posted by the CDC, by HUD. We have those resources at the end of the slide deck for you to consider. And then lastly, thinking about supporting your staff with hazard pay, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide, please. So ESG-CV can actually be used to cover hazard pay, and there's a variety of ways that this can happen. It could either be added on to someone's paycheck and administered throughout the pandemic, or it could be a one-time bonus to staff who are directly interacting with individuals who could put them at increased risk of exposure. And just so that you know, no matter which route you decide to go, you need to have a documented policy that is adopted prior to giving the hazard pay. It needs to be consistent and reasonable with your written compensation policies, and you need to outline the amount that you're providing for hazard pay, the length of time, and how you determined who receives it. This is a great tool for all of you to have in your tool belt because, as we've been talking about, hiring can be challenging, and this is a unique opportunity to provide that through signing bonuses, even if you need help, but also just acknowledging your staff that given our stressful circumstances, you're acknowledging it through this particular type of pay. Next slide, please. We also just wanted to highlight that availability for vaccination efforts. We know that folks experiencing homelessness are highly vulnerable to a variety of things, and we want to make sure that they have equitable access to vaccines throughout the entire state. And so here are some ideas of ways that you can incorporate that into your own programs and where it can be billed, because people are always wondering, like, great that I could spend it, but how? And I would say we have some additional slides that we don't have time today to get through that are like based on the specific programs such as street outreach, shelter, rapid rehousing. They'll be in the slide deck. And also I would just encourage you, if you have questions about that type of material, please reach out to your grant administrator. They're available to talk with you individually about how that relates to how you deploy these funds in your community. Ari, if you wouldn't mind skipping all the way down to the resources slide, which is slide 68. Thank you. I know, don't get dizzy, everybody. We're going to put forward just kind of a list of some of the resources. Next slide, please. These are all hyperlinks to things that are specific to our COVID response. We've been doing this for a while, but it's always helpful to just reopen some of these things, brush up our memory to make sure that these practices are being followed. Remind staff, and training is an eligible expense for preventing, preparing, responding to COVID. So keep those parts or those muscles tightened and strong throughout this. Next slide, please. We also have a lot of different resources that are available here that we've highlighted that we thought might be of interest given our conversations today about staffing. And on our next slide are some great resources from some of our national partners related to equity. And then we got more resources. I feel like I'm Vanna Wright right now. Next slide is about ESG specific resources for you. And also finally, our state specific resources. You might have questions about that. And we have some different things such as the brand new strategic funding guide that was released, I believe it was last week, could have been the week before, from the Homeless Finance Council or Coordinating Council, got the acronym wrong. Tremendous resource on the next slide, please, Ari, that would be useful as you're just trying to think, how do I use all of this funding available to my community to best serve those who are most vulnerable? So as we're approaching the end of the hour on our final slide, I just wanted to create space just for us all to acknowledge that times have been challenging, it's been stressful, we're all moving at faster and faster paces, and it can be hard to find moments of rest and pause. But as just a kind of a statement or a quote to end our time together is to share that my humanity is bound up in yours. for we can only be human together, which was said by Desmond Tutu. We recognize that you all are doing a lot, and we're so grateful for the time that you've given just by being a part of this conversation and sharing resources with your partners across the state. We appreciate you. We appreciate all of the tremendous work that you're doing in the community, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your Monday. Thank you so much for joining us.